It is September, in Warsaw, and the most connected human being in the history of mathematics is dying in a hospital room with no one in it who knows him. There is a plane ticket in his coat. He is already booked to the next conference in Lithuania, because there is always a next conference, and he finished a new paper only the day before. His heart stops, and then a short while later, it stops again. Somewhere out in the world, 250,000 people are linked to this man through chains of collaboration, and not one of them is in the room. We do not even know his last words. That happened on the 20th of September, 1996. But the chain of events that led a man with 511 collaborators to die as an unattended node started 83 years earlier in a Budapest apartment that was already in mourning before he was born. Therefore, we go back to two sisters dead of scarlet fever the week he arrived, to a father lost for 6 years in a Siberian prison camp, to a boy who could tell you how many seconds you had been alive and could not tie his own shoes, to a man who owned nothing but a half-empty suitcase, gave away every prize he ever won, took amphetamines for 25 years, and called God the Supreme Fascist for hoarding the perfect proofs. And to the one question his own biographers could never settle, the question that gets worse the closer you look at it: whether there was ever anyone home. So get comfortable, subscribe or join if you have not, because this channel runs on the people who stay for the long ones. And if you want to go further into the same territory, space, physics, mathematics, deep time, and the slow ways things come apart, that is what the Patreon is for. Stay to the end, because by the time we come back to that room in Warsaw, you are going to understand why the most connected man who ever lived died with no one beside him, and what that says about whether anyone was ever really there, including in you. Let's go back to where this began. He could not boil an egg. For most of his life, he could not do his own laundry, could not cook a meal, could not drive a car, could not write a check without help, and by more than one account did not butter his own bread until he was 21 years old. He had no house. He had no apartment, no bed that was his, no desk that was his, no country that fully wanted him. Everything he owned in the world fit inside a single grey suitcase that was always half empty, and he carried it across borders and oceans for 50 years, the way other people carry a thought they cannot put down. And this man, this functionally helpless man, who would arrive on your doorstep with that suitcase and nowhere else to be, published 1,525 mathematical papers, more than any human being who has ever lived, more than Euler, who needed a team of scribes and a longer life to come close. He did this with no laboratory, no institution paying him a salary, no office, and no fixed address on the entire planet. He did it out of a suitcase, in other people's spare bedrooms, fueled by coffee, and for the last 25 years, by amphetamines he took every single day. The official story is that he was a lovable eccentric, a sweet, childlike genius who loved numbers and wandered the earth making friends. You have probably encountered some version of this, the warm little anecdote about the mathematician who owned nothing and gave everything away. That version is not false exactly. It is just the sanitized one, the one that has had all the disturbing parts quietly removed, the way you would remove a stain. And what was removed is the only part that actually matters. Because if you sit with the real shape of this life, the helplessness and the output together, the suitcase and the 1,500 papers in the same frame, a very uncomfortable question starts to form. It is the question that the people who knew him best could never quite answer, the question his two biographers circled for years and never resolved. The question I want you to hold in your mind for the next 2 hours, because everything after this comes back to it. The question is, whether there was ever anyone home. I mean that as literally as it can be meant. Here was a human being who had systematically removed from his life almost every feature we use to define a self. No home, no partner, no children, no possessions beyond a suitcase, no religion he believed in, no nation, no bank account that stayed full for more than a week, no capacity to perform the basic acts of keeping a body alive. What was left, when you stripped all of that away, was a single function operating at a level no other human has reached. He existed to find mathematical truths and to connect the people who could find them with him. That was the whole of him. And the deeper you go into how that came to be, the harder it becomes to shake the feeling that you are not looking at an unusual man at all. You are looking at something else wearing the shape of a man, an instrument, a receiver, a device the universe built to make a small piece of itself briefly visible and then switched off. I am aware of how that sounds. I want to be careful here, because this is a channel about real things, and the easy move would be to lean into mysticism and let you feel a cheap shiver. That is not what this is. Every claim I am going to make about Paul Erdős is documented, sourced, and verifiable. And where the sources disagree, I am going to tell you they disagree. The unsettling part is not something I am adding. It is sitting right there in the facts, in the bibliography, in the obituaries written by the people who loved him, and almost nobody who tells you the cute version wants to say it out loud. His name was Paul Erdős. In Hungarian it is closer to Erdos, and he was born in Budapest on the 26th of March, 1913, into a world that was about to end. And to understand what he became, you have to start with the fact that he arrived into a house that was already in mourning for him before he had done anything at all. Both of his parents were high school mathematics teachers. His mother was named Anna, his father Lajos, and they were Jewish in a Hungary that was sliding toward the worst century it would ever have. Anna was pregnant with her third child in the spring of 1913. She already had 2 daughters, 2 little girls, and while she was in the hospital giving birth to the boy who would become the most prolific mathematician in history, both of those daughters died at home. Scarlet fever, in the middle of a Budapest epidemic. They were roughly 3 and 5 years old. By the time Anna came back from the hospital holding her newborn son, the other 2 children were gone. Think about what that does to a person. She had walked out of her home with 2 children and a pregnancy, and she walked back in with 1 infant and 2 fresh graves. Paul Erdős did not just lose 2 sisters he never met. He was born into the exact center of that loss, the replacement, the one who lived. And his mother responded the way a mind responds when it has been broken in a very specific place. She decided, at some level beneath conscious choice, that she would not lose this one, whatever it took. What it took was the erasure of his childhood as anything resembling a normal childhood. Anna kept him home. Germs had killed her daughters, and so the world outside the apartment became a thing to be feared, and Paul was kept inside it, protected, monitored, rarely allowed to attend regular school. For long stretches he was educated at home by tutors and by a German governess while his mother worked. He was kept clean and warm and safe and almost entirely apart from other children. And in that quiet, sealed, overprotected room, with very little to do and a mind that was already extraordinary, he turned to the only thing in the apartment that was infinite. He turned to numbers. By the age of 3, he could multiply 3-digit numbers together in his head. He had a party trick, if you can call it that, for a child who almost never saw a party. A guest would visit, and little Paul would ask them what year they were born and what time of day, and then he would tell them, after a moment, how many seconds they had been alive. He was 3 years old, and computing the length of strangers' lives in seconds. At 3 or 4, entirely on his own, with no one teaching him, he discovered negative numbers. He was playing with subtraction, took 250 away from 100, and announced to the room that the answer was 150 below 0. He had independently reinvented a concept it took human mathematics centuries to accept. But here is the detail I want you to hold, because it is going to matter more and more as we go. While this 3-year-old was reinventing the number line, he could not tie his own shoes. By some accounts, he was 11 before he managed it. He could compute how many seconds a stranger had lived, and he could not have made that stranger a cup of tea. The faculty that handles abstract mathematical structure was developing at a velocity that has rarely been seen in any human being who ever lived. And the faculty that handles being a person, feeding yourself, caring for yourself, simply was not developing at all. It was not damaged. It was just never switched on, because his mother switched it on for him every day for decades. You can already see, this early, the shape of the instrument being made, a mind aimed at one thing with terrifying precision, while everything else atrophied for lack of use. And the easy reading is that this was a tragedy, an overprotective mother accidentally crippling a child. But sit with it a little longer, and a colder reading is available. What if the helplessness was not a side effect? What if the helplessness was the cost of the precision? What if you cannot have a mind that does what his mind did unless something else, the part that learns to butter bread and survive on its own, is sacrificed to make room? I told you I would flag the places where the popular story gets the facts wrong, because the truth is almost always stranger than the legend, and you deserve the real version. So here is the first one, and it concerns his father. The legend, repeated in places that should know better, including some encyclopedia entries, is that Lashus Erdos was murdered in the Holocaust. It is a clean, terrible story, and it fits the mood. It is also, according to the best scholarly sources, not what happened. The most authoritative account, the obituary written for the notices of the American Mathematical Society by the mathematicians Selberg and Joel Spencer, both of whom knew Erdos, states that his father died of a heart attack in Budapest in 1942, not in a camp, not at the hands of the regime directly, a heart in a city giving out under the weight of the years. The Holocaust did take members of the family. 4 of the 5 siblings of his mother were murdered after Germany occupied Hungary on the 19th of March, 1944, when, in Babai's chilling phrase, the clockwork of the final solution engulfed Hungarian Jewry. 2 aunts, 2 uncles, gone. His mother survived almost by accident. But the father died of a failing heart, alone in the sense that his only son was an ocean away. And that distinction matters, because the real story is not a man killed by soldiers. It is a family slowly torn apart across continents by history, with the son too far away to hold any of it together. That is somehow worse, and it is true, and you were probably told the other thing. There is one more piece of the childhood that you need, and it is the one that tells you the loneliness was structural from the very beginning. When the First World War broke out, Paul was barely a year old, and his father Lashus was conscripted, captured by the Russian army, and sent to a prisoner of war camp in Siberia. He was gone for 6 years. 6 years on the far side of a continent, in a camp, while his wife worked long days and a German governess raised the boy. Lashus taught himself English in that camp, out of textbooks, with no one to speak it to and no one to correct him. So he learned the words, but invented his own pronunciations for half of them. And when he came home and taught his son English, Paul absorbed the mistakes whole. For the rest of his life, in lecture halls on 5 continents, Paul Erdős spoke English with the accent of a Siberian prison camp, filtered through a man who had never heard the language spoken correctly. He carried his absent father's isolation in his own mouth every day and never knew anything was wrong with it. The personal and the structural are not two separate threads here. They are the same thread. A boy raised in a sealed room because his sisters died, by a mother who could not let go, with a father imprisoned on the other side of the world, in a country that was about to start passing laws against people like him. Everything that would later look like eccentricity, the nomadism, the inability to be alone, the way he would arrive at your house and need you to take care of him. All of it is already visible in 1919, in an apartment in Budapest, in a child who has learned that the only thing that is safe, the only thing that does not die or disappear or get taken away to Siberia is mathematics. And Hungary was about to teach him that lesson again, harder. After the war, the country convulsed. There was a short-lived communist revolution under Blakun, and then a violent right-wing counter-revolution under Miklos Horthy, and Horthy's regime began doing to Hungary's Jews what Germany would not start doing for more than a decade. In 1920, 13 years before Hitler took power, Hungary passed a law called the Numerous Clauses, a quota that sharply restricted the number of Jewish students allowed into universities. Anna, Paul's mother, lost her position as a head teacher because she would not join a strike against the Kuhn government, and the family spent the early 20s in genuine fear. So the lesson arrived early, and it arrived twice. The world is not safe. The institutions will turn on you. The only thing they cannot take, because it does not live in any country and cannot be put in a camp, is a proof. Despite the quota, Erdos got into the University of Budapest in 1930 at 17 by winning a national examination so decisively that they could not keep him out. And almost immediately he did the thing that announced what he was. There is a classical result called Bertrand's postulate, the statement that between any whole number greater than 1 and its double, there is always at least one prime number. It had been proved before by the Russian mathematician Chebyshev, but the proof was heavy, analytic, the mathematical equivalent of moving a piano with a crane. Erdos, as a teenager, found a new proof, an elementary one, short, clean, using nothing but careful reasoning about how the prime factors of certain numbers have to distribute themselves. It was the kind of proof that makes older mathematicians go quiet. He published it. He was 18 years old, and it was his first paper, and there would be 1,524 more. This is the moment to introduce the idea that is going to sit underneath this entire story, the idea that turns a biography into something closer to cosmic horror. Erdos did not think of himself as inventing that proof. To him, and to a great many serious mathematicians, the proof was not a thing he made. It was a thing he found. It had been there before he was born. It would be there after the sun dies. He had simply for a moment, with a mind tuned finely enough to receive it, glimpsed something that already existed. Hold that. We will come back to it. And when we do, it is going to be much darker than it sounds right now. In the winter of 1932 and into 1933, a small group of young Jewish mathematicians in Budapest began meeting regularly, often outdoors, in the city park, near a strange hooded statue called the Anonymous, a monument to an unnamed medieval chronicler. They were students and recent graduates, brilliant, broke, and increasingly aware that the country was turning into a trap. Their names were George Shakiris, Esther Klein, Mirta Waxberger, George S. Feud, Andrei Mackay, and Paul Erdős. They called themselves, after the statue, the Anonymous Group. And what they did under that hood, almost as a game, was rediscover and push forward an entire branch of mathematics. One day, Esther Klein brought them a little puzzle she had been thinking about. Take 5 points, scattered on a piece of paper, with no three of them in a straight line. She claimed that no matter how you place those 5 points, you can always find 4 of them that form a convex quadrilateral, a 4-sided shape with no dents in it. The group worked on it, proved she was right, and then Erdos and Suitcase did what Erdos would do for the rest of his life. They asked a bigger, more dangerous question. Forget 5 points and a quadrilateral. For any shape you want, a pentagon, a hexagon, a 1,000-sided figure, is there always some number of points large enough that, however you scatter them, you are guaranteed to find your shape hiding inside them? And they proved that the answer is yes. The result connected to the work of a young Englishman named Frank Ramsey, who had died at 26, and it helped open up the field now called Ramsey theory, whose central, slightly terrifying claim is that complete disorder is impossible, that in any large enough system, no matter how random, structure is forced to appear whether the universe wants it there or not. Erdos gave this particular result a name. He called it the happy ending problem, not because of the mathematics, because George Suitcase and Esther Klein, working on her puzzle together under the hood of the anonymous statue, fell in love. They married in 1937. And here is the detail that I find almost unbearable. The kind of thing that, if you put it in a novel, an editor would tell you to cut for being too neat. George and Esther Suitcase stayed married for 68 years. They lived long lives, had children, grew old together in Adelaide, Australia, and on the 28th of August, 2005, in the same nursing home, they died within 1 hour of each other. The two people whose love gave the happy ending problem its name left the world holding hands across a single hour after 68 years. Erdos, who named it, would not be there to see it. He had been dead for 9 years by then. He never married anyone. He never, by the account of those closest to him, had a romantic or physical relationship with another human being in his entire life. The man who named the happy ending problem was the one person in that story who never got one. I am telling you this not because it is a sad coincidence, though it is, but because it is the first clear instance of a pattern that runs through his whole life like a fault line. Erdos was the connective tissue. He was the one who brought people together, who put Esther's puzzle in front of George, who introduced collaborators who would marry, who linked the entire planet's mathematicians into a single web with himself at the center. And he was, himself, almost completely alone. He generated human connection the way a power station generates electricity, vast quantities of it, none of it for himself, the building cold and humming and empty in the middle of all that current. Keep watching for it. It happens again and again, and it ends, 50 years later, in a hospital room in Warsaw. By 1934, the trap was closing. Erdos, 21 years old, Jewish, brilliant, and increasingly unwelcome in his own country, took a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Manchester, in England. He was in effect being pushed out of Hungary for being who he was. In Manchester and Cambridge, he met the people who would matter, including the great English mathematician G. H. Hardy and a Polish mathematician named Stanisław Ulam, who would later help design the hydrogen bomb. And then, in 1938, after Hitler annexed Austria and the crisis over Czechoslovakia made it obvious which way the continent was going, Erdos did the thing that saved his life. He left for the United States, taking a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, the same institution that housed Einstein. He got out. Most of the people in this story did not get out, and we are going to have to talk about that. But Paul Erdős got out, and he would spend the rest of his life as a man with no home to go back to, because the home no longer existed, and the world that had made it had set itself on fire. Princeton did not like him. This is one of those facts that the cute version leaves out, and it tells you something about both the man and the institution. The Institute for Advanced Study was the most prestigious gathering of pure intellect on the planet, and they found Paul Erdős, in their own assessment, uncouth and unconventional. He did not dress correctly. He did not observe the social rituals. He would corner people and talk mathematics at all hours. And he had no interest in the polite careerist performance that the place ran on. So they declined to renew his fellowship for the full term everyone had expected. They gave him 6 months instead of a year, and effectively let him drift away. The most prolific mathematician in human history was, at the start of his career, quietly shown the door by the most important institute in his field, because he made the faculty uncomfortable. Watch this pattern, because it is going to define the institutional half of this story. Erdős was never quite respectable enough for the establishment, and the establishment was never quite honest about why. It was not that his mathematics was weak. His mathematics was some of the strongest anyone was doing. It was that he would not be housebroken. He would not take the salaried position, would not join the department, would not play the game, and a system built on the game does not know what to do with a person who refuses to play it and is better than everyone playing. So he became something the modern world had almost no category for. He became a wandering scholar in the medieval sense, a man with no fixed post who moved from university to university, from colleague to colleague, carrying his work on his back. Pennsylvania, Notre Dame. Purdue, Stanford, Syracuse, he never stayed long. He would arrive, work with whoever was there, exhaust the local problems, and move on. And while he was doing this, while he was crisscrossing a country that had taken him in, the country he came from was being emptied of everyone he had left behind. From 1941 to 1945, he had no contact with his family at all. None. He was in America, building a new way of being a mathematician, and on the other side of an ocean and a war his mother was hiding, his father's heart had already given out, and the machinery of the final solution was working through the Jews of Hungary with that clockwork Babai described. Erdős was 27, 28, 29 years old, and the people who knew him in those years describe a man who was homesick, who was unhappy, who was constantly, gnawingly worried about a mother he could not reach and could not protect. The helplessness his mother had built into him as a child now ran in the other direction. He could not take care of himself, and he also could not take care of the one person who had always taken care of him, and she was inside the worst thing that has ever happened. The news came by telegram in August of 1945. 4 of his mother's siblings murdered. Members of his own mathematical circle dead. 2 of his collaborators, Erwin Feldheim and Jar Grunwald, killed. The graph theorist Ness Nig, a man whose work Erdős built on, took his own life rather than report to the ghetto. His mother, Anna, survived. Almost no one would have bet on it, and she survived. And the thing you have to understand about Paul Erdős from this point forward is that he had now lost, or nearly lost, every fixed point a human life is supposed to have. The sisters before he was born, the father across an ocean, the country, the home, the entire civilization that produced him, fed into the furnace. What was left was his mother, who would live until 1971, and mathematics, which would live forever. Those were the 2 things he had. And when the first one died, in 1971, the second one nearly killed him, and we will get to exactly how. But first I have to show you the mathematics itself, because if you do not understand what he was actually doing, you cannot understand why I keep calling him an instrument rather than a man. And the single most important thing he did, the idea that changed how mathematics is practiced, and that points straight at the disturbing core of this whole story, is something called the probabilistic method. Here is the problem it solves, and I am going to walk you through it slowly because the strangeness is in the details. Mathematicians are constantly trying to prove that certain objects exist. A graph with a certain property, a coloring that avoids a certain pattern, a structure that does a certain job. And the obvious way to prove that something exists is to build it. You construct the thing, you point at it, you say, there it is, it exists, I made one. That is how almost all of mathematics worked for almost all of history. To prove existence, exhibit the object. In 1947, in a short paper in the Bulletin of the American Mathematical Society, Erdos did something that should genuinely unsettle you the first time you understand it. He proved that a certain kind of object had to exist without ever building one, without ever pointing at one, without anyone, then or now, having the faintest idea what one actually looks like. The problem was about Ramsey numbers, the same Ramsey theory from the park in Budapest. The question was, roughly, how large can a system get before it is forced to contain a large amount of order? Specifically, can you color the connections in a big network with two colors, red and blue, in such a way that you avoid creating any large group that is all one color? Erdos wanted to prove that such clever colorings exist, that you can stave off order longer than people thought, and building one by hand is a nightmare. The number of possible colorings is astronomical, and most of them fail. So he did not build one. Instead, he imagined coloring the entire network completely at random. Every connection, flip a coin, red or blue. And then he calculated the probability that a random coloring done this way would fail, would accidentally contain one of the forbidden all-one color groups. He showed that if the network is the right size, that probability of failure is less than 1. Less than 100%. And here is the move that I still find slightly vertiginous no matter how many times I see it. If the probability of failing is less than 1, then the probability of succeeding is greater than 0. And if even one possibility in the entire space of possibilities succeeds, then a successful coloring must exist. It has to. You have just proved that the object is out there, somewhere in the space of all possible colorings, without constructing it, without seeing it, without being able to find it. I need you to feel how strange this is. He proved that a thing exists by proving that the universe of possibilities does not have enough room to exclude it. The object is real, mathematically certain, its existence beyond any doubt. And it is, in a precise sense, invisible. You know it is there the way you might know, from the gravitational wobble of a star, that a planet must exist around it, except worse, because you cannot even go and look. The proof guarantees the object and forbids you from ever meeting it. That 1947 argument did two things. First, it founded an entire modern field. The probabilistic method is now one of the central tools in combinatorics and computer science. And the lower bound Erdos proved that day for these Ramsey numbers, the bound of roughly 2 to the power of k over 2, stood essentially untouched for the better part of a century. In 1975, the mathematician Joel Spencer squeezed out a small constant improvement using another Erdos-related tool. And then, nothing. For 78 years, the only progress on the bound Erdos, proved in a few lines in 1947, was a tweak to a constant. It was not until July of 2025 that three mathematicians, J. Ma, Wuji Shen, and Shenji She, posted a paper claiming the first genuinely exponential improvement over Erdős's 1947 bound. A result now on its way into one of the most prestigious journals in the field. 78 years. He scribbled a bound in a few lines, almost as an afterthought to demonstrate a method, and it took the entire profession the better part of a century to push past it. But the second thing that argument did is the thing that matters for our story. It quietly suggested that mathematical truth has a structure that does not care at all about human beings and may not even require us to be able to see it. The objects are there. Existence does not wait for construction. The truths sit in their space, complete, whether or not any mind ever tunes to the right frequency to confirm them. Erdos spent his life proving things exist. And more, what he proved was that they exist out there, in a realm that has nothing to do with us, that was full before we arrived, and will be full after we are gone. Now I have to tell you about the worst thing the establishment did to him, because it is the clearest case of the abdication of authority in his whole life, and because the people who tell you the cute version almost never mention it. It is the story of the elementary proof of the prime number theorem, and it cost Erdos a friendship, a Fields Medal, and a measure of justice he never got back. The prime number theorem is one of the deepest facts in all of mathematics. It describes how the prime numbers thin out as you go higher, how they become rarer in a precise, predictable way. It was proved in 1896, independently, by two mathematicians using the heavy machinery of complex analysis, functions of imaginary numbers, contour integrals, the whole analytic toolkit. And for the next 50 years, the consensus hardened into something close to dogma. The great G. H. Hardy, the same Hardy from Cambridge, said in 1921 that an elementary proof, a proof using no complex analysis, was probably impossible, and that if anyone ever found one, the whole theory would have to be rewritten. It became a famous, settled belief. You could not prove this thing the simple way. It was too deep. The depth required the heavy machinery. In 1948, at the Institute for Advanced Study, a brilliant young Norwegian named Atle Selberg proved a powerful new formula, an elementary one. After a colleague gave a lecture on Selberg's formula, Erdos, who was there, took it away and within hours, used it to derive a crucial step about the spacing of consecutive primes. The two men, Selberg and Erdos, working in parallel and feeding off each other, closed the gap. Together they had the elementary proof of the prime number theorem that Hardy had said could not exist. They had rewritten the rules. It should have been one of the great collaborative triumphs of 20th century mathematics. It became one of its ugliest feuds. And the feud was not about who proved what. Both men understood perfectly well who had contributed which piece. The feud was about how to publish it. Erdos, true to everything he was, wanted a joint paper, both names, the truth laid out together, the way he did everything, collaboratively, openly, as a shared act. Selberg did not. Selberg wanted to publish his part separately, under his own name, and he made that clear in a way that left scars. In a letter that the mathematician Dorian Goldfeld later recovered and published, Selberg wrote that he simply did not like that somebody else had started working on his unpublished results before he considered himself finished with them. There had been an incident, repeated by witnesses, where a mathematician greeted Selberg with the news of what, in his telling, Erdos and some Scandinavian mathematician had done, and the slight of being the unnamed Scandinavian, the afterthought in his own theorem, hardened some. Selberg eventually wrote to Erdos and told him, in effect, I am going to publish my proof, and if you do not accept this arrangement, I will publish it anyway. And the establishment lined up behind Selberg. Hermann Weyl, one of the most powerful mathematicians alive, took Selberg's side. When Erdos submitted his account, the referee did not recommend it, and one of the most important journals in the field declined to publish his version. Erdos ended up publishing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, while Selberg published the cleaner, solo account in the Annals of Mathematics, the most prestigious journal there is. And in 1950, the establishment delivered its verdict in the form of the highest honor in mathematics. Paul Selberg was awarded the Fields Medal, the closest thing mathematics has to a Nobel Prize, given partly for this very work. Erdos received the Cole Prize in 1952, a real honor, but not the same thing, not remotely the same thing. The man who had taken Selberg's formula and cracked the problem open in an afternoon watched the profession crown the other man and hand him the lesser prize, and he never fully got over it. Here is the friction I want to leave you with, because it is the kind of thing the diplomatic version of this story sounds smooth. The mathematical community did not punish Erdos because his contribution was small. His contribution was enormous, and everyone knew it. They punished him because he insisted on doing the thing his entire life was built around: sharing, collaborating, putting both names on the truth, in a profession that rewards the solitary genius who plants his own flag. Erdos's deepest value, the open hand, the shared proof, the brain that is open to anyone, was treated as a kind of impropriety. And there is one last twist that turns the whole thing into something close to tragedy. Goldfeld, surveying the history decades later, noted something brutal. To this day, no result has been obtained from the elementary proof of the prime number theorem that could not be obtained, in stronger form, by the old analytic methods. The proof that broke a friendship and bent the course of two careers turned out, in terms of pure mathematical fruit, to be a dead end. Selberg himself said he became so disgusted with the whole affair that he never lectured on the proof again. Two of the greatest mathematicians of the century tore their relationship apart over a result that led, in the end, almost nowhere. The Supreme Fascist, as Erdos would have said, was laughing. I keep mentioning the Supreme Fascist, so let me finally tell you who that is, because it is the doorway into the strangest and most revealing part of Paul Erdős, the private language he built to live inside. Erdos, over decades, constructed an entire vocabulary of his own, a personal dialect that he used with everyone, and it was not a quirk. It was a worldview, compressed into words. To Erdos, a child was an epsilon, because in the calculus the Greek letter epsilon stands for an arbitrarily small quantity, and so children were small quantities, little epsilons running around. Women were bosses, men were slaves. To get married was to be captured. To get divorced was to be liberated. To remarry was to be recaptured. Music was noise. Alcohol was poison. To give a mathematical lecture was to preach. The United States was Sam. The Soviet Union was Joe, after Uncle Sam and Joseph Stalin. To give someone an oral examination was to torture them. And there were two words that mattered more than all the others, the two that tell you what he actually believed about the shape of a life. When a mathematician stopped doing mathematics, Erdos said that person had died. And when a person actually, physically died, their heart stopped, they were buried, Erdos said only that they had left. Read those two again, and let the order of them register. To stop doing mathematics was to die. To die was merely to leave. He had inverted the most basic fact of human existence. For Paul Erdős, the death that counted, the real death, was the cessation of the work. Physical death was a lesser event, a departure, a stepping out of the room. The body was the trivial part. The mathematics was the life, which is exactly what you would expect a person to believe if that person were not really a person at all in the way you are, but an instrument that understood at some level that its only function, and therefore its only life, was the thing it was built to do. And presiding over all of it was the Supreme Fascist. The he called it. God, in the Erdos theology, was a malevolent being whose entire purpose was to make human beings suffer, and more specifically, to torment mathematicians by hiding from them the things they most wanted to find. The Sif hid your socks. The Sif stole your passport at the worst moment. And above all, the Sif kept the book. The book is the center of everything. Erdos believed, or said he believed, or believed in the specific way that a man can believe a thing and also be performing it, that God maintained a transfinite book, an infinite volume, in which was written the single most beautiful, most perfect, most elegant proof of every theorem that is true. Every mathematical fact that holds, every truth there is, has in the book one ideal proof, the proof as it should be, stripped of all clumsiness, reduced to pure necessity. And the job of a mathematician, the whole job, was to catch glimpses of the book, to find occasionally, by luck and labor, and a mind tuned finely enough, a page of it. When a colleague produced a proof of surpassing beauty, Erdős's highest possible praise was 3 words. This one is from the book. He once said that you do not have to believe in God, but you should believe in the book. He described himself as an agnostic, said he doubted God existed, and in the same breath insisted on the absolute reality of the infinite book of perfect proofs that this non-existent God was hoarding. Now you might want to file this under harmless eccentricity, a charming bit of whimsy from a sweet old man, and one of his closest collaborators, Günther Ziegler, who later co-wrote an actual book called Proofs from the Book in his honor, has said something to that effect, that the God and book business was part of Erdős's storytelling, his comic routine, that he was more interested in being funny than in preaching theology. I want to give you that, honestly, because the audience deserves the honest version, and Ziegler knew him and I did not. The book may have been theater, but here is why I do not think you can dismiss it, and why I think it is the key to the whole man. Strip the comedy away, and the book is a precise, almost technical statement of a serious philosophical position, a position that most working mathematicians quietly hold and that almost nobody outside mathematics is ever told about. It is called mathematical Platonism, and it is the belief that mathematical truths are not invented by human beings, but discovered, that they exist independently of us, eternally, in a realm as real as the physical world, the way the planet Neptune existed before anyone found it. On this view, when you prove a theorem, you are not creating anything. You are an explorer. You are a kind of geologist of an abstract landscape that was complete before the first human drew the first triangle in the sand, and will be complete after the last star burns out. The mathematician Reuben Hirsch put it about as starkly as it can be put. According to Platonism, a mathematician is an empirical scientist like a geologist. He cannot invent anything, because it is all there already. All he can do is discover. That is the book, with the jokes removed, an eternal, complete, perfect body of mathematical truth, existing whether or not we exist, that the human mind can occasionally and partially glimpse. Erdős dressed it up as a malevolent God-hoarding proofs, because that was funny, and because it gave him someone to be angry at. But the underlying claim is not a joke, and it is not fringe. It is, if anything, the default working faith of people who spend their lives at the frontier of mathematics. And it has a consequence that I do not think Erdős ever flinched from, because flinching from it would have required him to be the kind of person who flinches. If the truths are already there, complete, in the book, then the mathematician is not their author. The mathematician is their instrument. The proof Erdős found of Bertrand's postulate at 18 was not his. It was the book's, and he was the antenna that happened to be tuned to receive it that year. The probabilistic method was not invented in 1947. It was uncovered, glimpsed, transcribed by a man who had ground himself down into a fine enough receiver to catch it. And if that is true, then the 1,525 papers are not really the achievements of a person named Paul Erdős. They are pages of the book that pass through a particular human nervous system on their way from eternity into the published literature. He was not the source. He was the channel. And a channel, however magnificent, is not a self. It is a pipe through which something else flows. This is the second time I am asking you to hold the instrument idea, and you can feel it getting heavier now. We started with a man who could not butter his own bread. We are arriving at a man who may not, in the deepest sense, have considered the bread, or the body that needed it, or the loneliness, to be him at all. He was the part of the universe that the truths passed through. Everything else was maintenance, which is why he gave the money away. People love this part of the story because it sounds saintly, and there is something saintly in it, but the deeper reading is colder and truer. Erdos kept almost nothing. When he won the Wolf Prize in 1984, the richest award in mathematics, about $50,000, he kept $720 of it and gave the rest away, including a large chunk to a second cousin he barely knew who happened to be in need, and a sum to establish a prize in Israel in memory of his parents, Anna and Lashos. He gave money to students. He gave money to strangers. He once gave nearly an entire month's worth of his income to a beggar at a train station. When a young man who wanted to study at Harvard could not afford it, Erdos lent him $1,000 and told him to pay it back only when it would not cause him any hardship. And when the young man asked years later about interest, Erdos told him to do with the $1,000 what Erdos had done, which is to say, give it to the next person who needed it. He died with about $25,000 to his name, and most of that was probably accidental, money that had simply arrived faster than he could give it away. The saintly reading is that he was generous. The truer reading is that money, like the bread, like the laundry, like the house he never bought, was simply not part of what he was. Property, he liked to say, borrowing from the anarchist Proudhon, is a nuisance. You do not refuse to own things across an entire lifetime because you are generous. You refuse because owning things requires a self that persists in one place and accumulates, and he did not have that kind of self. He had a suitcase and a function. The function did not need a savings account. And so he moved. For more than half a century, he moved. He would arrive at a colleague's house, often with little warning, sometimes with a phone call from the airport, and he would announce himself with 3 words that became famous in mathematics, and that I think are some of the most haunting words ever used as a greeting. My brain is open. That was the hello. Not how are you, not it is good to see you, but a declaration that the instrument had arrived and was ready to receive. He would stay for a few days, work 18 or 19 hours at a stretch, and then ask his exhausted host whom he should visit next, and he would leave for the next house. Another roof, another proof, he would say. The hosts had to do everything. Feed him, launder his clothes, drive him, manage his money. Some of them did his taxes. There are stories of him cutting open a carton of tomato juice the wrong way and leaving it bleeding across a kitchen counter, because the simple mechanics of the physical world were genuinely beyond him. He could fall asleep at the dinner table the moment the conversation drifted away from mathematics. The way a machine powers down when it is given no input it can use. There is a famous line about all of this, maybe the most famous line associated with him, that I have to correct, because the audience deserves accuracy, and because the truth is, as usual, a little stranger. The line is, a mathematician is a machine for turning coffee into theorems. It is quoted everywhere as Erdos, and it fits him so perfectly, the machine, the coffee, the output, that everyone assumes it must be his. It is not. The line belongs to his friend and countryman Alfred Rényi, another brilliant Hungarian mathematician, and Erdos himself credited Rényi with it. I find it telling that the single best one-sentence description of Paul Erdős as a coffee-powered theorem machine was not even said by Paul Erdős. It was said about the type of person he was the purest example of. He did not author the description of himself any more than he authored the theorems. Even his own legend was, in a sense, transcribed from somewhere else. But the coffee, in his case, was eventually the least of it. Because in 1971, the one fixed point that had survived everything, the sisters, the father, the Holocaust, the wandering, finally gave way. His mother died. Anna Erdős had survived the thing that killed 4 of her siblings. She had lived into her 90s, and in her last years she had done something extraordinary. She had started traveling with her son. Into her 80s, this woman went on the road with Paul, country to country, conference to conference, the two of them together, the boy she had sealed in a room to keep him alive, and the mother who had never stopped keeping him alive. And then, in 1971, she died, 91 years old, far from Budapest. And Paul Erdős, 58 years old, the most productive mathematician on earth, came apart. The grief did not look like ordinary grief, because nothing about him was ordinary. It looked like an intensification. A physician treating his depression prescribed antidepressants and stimulants, and from that point, for the last 25 years of his life, Paul Erdős took amphetamines, Benzedrine or Ritalin, 10 or 20 milligrams, nearly every single day, alongside enormous quantities of strong espresso and caffeine tablets, and he pushed his working day to 19, sometimes 20 hours. The output, which had always been superhuman, became something else. He was racing, he has himself said, more or less, what he was racing from and toward. There will be plenty of time to rest in the grave, he would say, when anyone urged him to slow down. I want to be very careful and very honest about the drugs, because this is exactly the kind of thing that a less responsible telling would sensationalize. And Erdős himself begged for it not to be sensationalized. Here is what we actually know and what we do not. We know he took them daily for 25 years. We know he started after his mother's death. What we do not know, what nobody can honestly claim to know, is whether the drugs made the mathematician. And there are strong reasons to think they did not, that this is the wrong way to understand him entirely. The obsession was not a product of the amphetamines. The obsession was there at age 3, computing the lifespans of strangers in seconds, 55 years before he ever took a stimulant. The monomania predated the chemistry by more than half a century. One researcher did try to analyze his output statistically and found that his productivity did rise after 1971, but also that around 3/4 of his most celebrated results came before 1971, before the drugs, and that the apparent effect was not statistically conclusive and was tangled up with other things, his mother's death freeing him onto the road full-time, the growth of his collaborator network. The drugs did not write the theorems. At most, they kept the machine running longer each day. The clearest window we have into what the drugs did to him is a bet, and it is the most quoted episode of his life. And for once, the famous version is essentially true. By 1979, his friend Ronald Graham, a mathematician at Bell Labs, who had effectively taken on the job of managing Erdős's money and life, was worried about the amphetamines. So Graham made him a bet, $500, that Erdős could not stop taking the drugs for a single month, 30 days. Erdős, who could never resist a wager any more than he could resist a problem, took it. And he won. He went cold turkey for the full month, took nothing, and collected his $500 from Graham. And then he said the thing. He told Graham, "You have shown me I am not an addict." But I did not get any work done. I would get up in the morning and stare at a blank piece of paper. I had no ideas. Just like an ordinary person. You have set mathematics back a month. And he immediately started taking the drugs again. Just like an ordinary person. Sit with that phrase, because it is one of the most quietly devastating things anyone has ever said about themselves. For 30 days, off the chemistry, Paul Erdős experienced what it is like to be you, to look at a blank page and have it stay blank, to have a mind that is not, at every waking moment, flooded with structure pouring in from somewhere else. And he described that experience, the experience of normal human consciousness, as a loss, as mathematics being set back, as a kind of death in his vocabulary, because for 30 days the work stopped, and the work was the life. Here is the question that opens underneath that story, and it is darker than the cute version of the bet ever lets you reach. When the drugs were in him, the ideas flooded in. When the drugs were gone, the page stayed blank. So which of those two states was Paul Erdős? We have been building toward the idea that he was an instrument, an antenna tuned to receive the contents of the book. But an antenna's reception depends entirely on how it is tuned. And what the Graham bet shows with brutal clarity is that the tuning was chemical. The flood of structure that he experienced as his own mind, as the thing that made him him, switched off when the amphetamines left his bloodstream and switched back on when they returned. The signal was always there. The book does not care whether you have taken your benzodrine, but the receiver only worked when it was chemically driven into the right state. And so you are left with a genuinely vertiginous possibility. Maybe the person, the Paul Erdős who stared at the blank page and felt like an ordinary man, was the real one, the helpless one, the lonely one, the orphan of a vanished world. And the great mathematician, the instrument flooded with the contents of eternity, was a state that a molecule produced, not a man, a tuning. I do not know how to resolve that, and I am not going to pretend to, because anyone who tells you they can resolve it is selling you something. But I will tell you that it changes the shape of the loneliness, because if the work was the life, and the work depended on the chemistry, then the man underneath, the one who was actually there at 3 a.m. when the espresso wore off, the one who was afraid, that man spent 50 years being eclipsed by the instrument he had made of himself. And we are going to meet that man, the one underneath, at the very end, in a hospital in Warsaw. Remember the blank page. We are going to come back to it. But before we get there, I have to show you the most astonishing thing he built. More astonishing in some ways than any single theorem, because it is the thing that took the dissolution of his self and turned it into a structure you can actually measure. I have to show you the network. Paul Erdős had, by the most careful count we have, 511 direct collaborators. 511 people who co-authored at least one paper with him. The list is maintained to this day by a mathematician named Jerry Grossman at Oakland University in something called the Erdős Number Project, and it is still, decades after his death, occasionally growing as posthumous papers get finished and published. 511. To understand how absurd that number is, you have to know that most mathematicians, most scientists of any kind, have a handful of collaborators across a career. A dozen, maybe 24 for a very social one. Erdős had over 500, and that is just the people he wrote papers with. The number of people he worked with, talked mathematics with, set problems for, runs into the thousands. And out of this fact, the mathematical community built a kind of game that turned into something much more profound than a game. It is called the Erdős number. Your Erdős number measures how far you are from Erdős in the web of collaboration. If you co-authored a paper directly with Erdős, your Erdős number is 1. There are 511 such people. If you never wrote with Erdős himself, but you wrote with one of those 511, your Erdős number is 2, and there are about 13,700 of those. If you wrote with someone who wrote with someone who wrote with Erdős, your number is 3. And so on, each step out one more link in the chain of human collaboration. Now here is what happens when you actually map this. Almost the entire community of research mathematicians on Earth, and a huge number of physicists, computer scientists, even biologists and economists who drifted close enough to mathematics, turns out to have a finite Erdos number. Something like 268,000 people are connected to this one man through chains of collaboration. And the chains are short. The median Erdos number is around 5. The average is under 5. Almost everyone with any connection at all is within 7 or 8 steps. Einstein's Erdos number is 2. Among the winners of the Fields Medal, the median is 3. The most connected human being in the history of science sat at the center of a web that pulls in 250,000 people. And from that center, you can reach almost any of them in 5 handshakes. This is the original, the prototype, of the idea you have heard 100 times in its diluted forms. 6 degrees of separation. The small world. The Kevin Bacon game, where actors are connected through films, is a direct conscious imitation of the Erdos number. The entire modern science of networks, the mathematics that describes how diseases spread and how social media works and how the brain wires itself, treats the Erdos collaboration graph as one of its founding examples. He did not just do mathematics. He became a mathematical object. He turned himself into the center of a graph so large and so well connected that it is now a standard illustration of how connection itself behaves. And I want you to see what that actually means about him, because this is the place where the network and the dissolution of the self meet, and it is the heart of everything. The reason Erdos sits at the center of that web is that he did not keep his mathematics. He gave it away, the same way he gave the money away, the same way he refused to own a house. He would arrive, my brain is open, and he would pour problems and ideas and half-finished proofs into whoever was in the room and put their name on the paper next to his and move on. He was not building a body of solitary work with his name on it, the way Selberg did, the way the establishment rewards. He was building a web of shared work that ran through everyone. He distributed himself. He took the contents of the book that passed through him, and he splintered them out across 511 other minds, and threw them into 250,000 more, which is why the Erdos number is, when you really look at it, a slightly eerie thing. It is a map of how thoroughly one human being dissolved himself into a collective. He has no single great monument, no one theorem that is the Erdos theorem the way relativity is Einstein's. His monument is the graph. His monument is the fact that the profession of mathematics is shaped, structurally, like a wheel with him at the hub. He stopped being a point and became a pattern of connections. He became, almost literally, the connective tissue between other people's brains. And connective tissue is not a person. It is the thing between persons. The most social man in the history of his field achieved that status precisely by having no self left to keep anything for. He was open the way an empty room is open. Anyone could walk in. Nothing was being saved for later, because there was no later self to save it for. Let me bring back the Platonism now, because it locks together with the network into something genuinely unsettling. If you believe, as Erdos functionally did, that the truths are out there in the book, complete and eternal, then the individual mathematician matters not at all. The truths do not need any particular person. If Erdos had never been born, the probabilistic method would still be true. It was true before him. Someone else, eventually, would have tuned to it. The theorems are not attached to him. They are attached to nothing human. They float in the Platonic realm, indifferent, and the human beings who find them are interchangeable, like radios tuned to the same station. The station does not care which radio is playing it. The music is the same. And Erdos lived this. He did not act like a man who thought his individual contribution was precious. and unique and his to protect. He acted like a man who knew the truths were going to come through somebody and was simply determined to be the somebody, as often and as widely as a single human nervous system could manage before the body gave out. He raced, not because he thought only he could find these things, but precisely because he knew he could not. He knew the body was temporary and the work was infinite. There will be plenty of time to rest in the grave. The grave is where the receiver finally goes silent. But the broadcast continues. The book does not close. He understood this with a clarity that should chill you, and he said it in different ways throughout his life. He said that mathematics is the only infinite human activity, that humanity will never finish it, because the subject is infinite, the numbers themselves are infinite. He said that mathematics is the surest path to immortality, that if you make a great discovery, you will be remembered after everyone else is forgotten. But notice the strange, displaced quality of that immortality. It is not that you live on, it is that the discovery lives on, and your name is attached to it like a label on a specimen. The thing that is immortal is the truth, which was never yours, which was in the book before you were born. You do not become immortal. You get to have your name written next to a piece of something that was already eternal. That is the most a human can hope for on this view. To be the radio that happened to be playing when a particular eternal frequency came through, and to have someone scratch your name into the side of the radio before it stops working. There is a small, perfect, terrible detail that shows even he drew arbitrary lines around which infinities he would let himself believe in. Late in his life, a mathematician named Melvin Nathanson was telling him about a certain exotic kind of number, the p-adic numbers, structures that are real and rigorous and used throughout modern number theory, but that are deeply counterintuitive. And Erdos, the supreme Platonist, the man who believed in the literal eternal existence of perfect proofs, looked at these numbers and said, "You know, they do not really exist." Even he flinched somewhere. Even the man who believed the book was real had a place where he stood and said, "No, that part is too strange. That is not in the book." Which tells you that the Platonism was not a neutral, worked-out philosophy. It was something closer to a faith, with its own arbitrary edges, its own articles he would and would not accept. He believed in the eternal realm of mathematical truth, the way a person believes in something they need to be true. And what he needed it to be true for, I think, is the thing we have been circling this whole time. He needed the work to be eternal, because the man was so utterly without anything else. If the truths are eternal and the people are interchangeable receivers, then there is one more thing Erdos did that makes perfect, chilling sense, and that almost no other mathematician has ever done at his scale. He put money on the things he could not find himself. He offered cash prizes out of his own pocket for the solutions to problems he posed, and the size of the prize was his honest estimate of how hard, how deep, how far into the book the answer was buried. A problem that was merely difficult might carry a reward of $25. A problem that he thought was genuinely profound, that might take a generation, could be worth 500, 1,000, 3,000. And his largest standing prize, the one he said he had offered somewhat rashly, was $10,000. For a question about how large the gaps between consecutive prime numbers can get. Over his life, he posed perhaps 1,000 of these problems, with rewards adding up to many tens of thousands of dollars, and there was never a complete list, because he carried most of them in his head and scattered them across the planet as he traveled. Solving an Erdos problem and receiving the check became one of the great honors in mathematics, and the strange, beautiful part is that many people who won never cashed the checks. They framed them. A signed check from Paul Erdős for the solution to a problem he had judged worth that exact amount of money was worth far more, as an object, than the money. People kept them on their walls like relics. Think about what this practice actually is. Underneath, it is a man placing bets against the book. It is a man saying, here is a truth that I am certain exists, that is sitting there complete in the eternal realm, and I cannot reach it. My receiver is not tuned finely enough, or my body will give out first. So I am putting money on the table for whoever can. The prizes are a map of his own limits, drawn in dollars. They are the places where he stood at the edge of what he could glimpse and marked the darkness beyond it, and paid in advance for someone else to bring back a light. And because the truths are eternal and the receivers interchangeable, the prizes did not die when he did. They outlived him. People are still solving Erdős problems and collecting the money from the foundation that now administers his estate, decades after the man himself went silent. The signal kept coming. Other radios kept tuning to it. He had simply marked the frequencies in advance and left money for whoever caught them next. And some of them have been caught, in ways that are almost too on the nose for what this story is about. There was a problem he first posed around 1932 when he was a teenager in the anonymous group, called the Erdős discrepancy problem. It is brutally simple to state and was brutally hard to solve. Take any infinite sequence of plus ones and minus ones, in any pattern you like. Erdős conjectured that no matter how cleverly you arrange them, you can always find a regularly spaced sub-pattern, every second term, or every third, or every seventh, whose running total eventually climbs as high as you want in size. That the imbalance can never be kept bounded forever. It sounds almost trivial. It resisted the entire profession for over 80 years, and it was finally proved in September of 2015 by Terence, who is widely regarded as the greatest living mathematician, building partly on a massive online collaboration of dozens of mathematicians and partly on his own deep work. Tao formally claimed the prize. He joked that he would not spend the money on journal fees, and there is a detail here that closes a circle across 30 years. Terence had met Paul Erdős once, in Adelaide, in 1985, when Tao was 10 years old, a prodigy being shown to the great wandering mathematician. The old receiver met the young one, and 30 years later, the young one finally tuned in the frequency the old one had marked, when he himself was barely more than a child. The problem was older than Tao. It was, in the only sense Erdős cared about, eternal. It simply waited for a receiver good enough. There was another, even deeper. Erdős, with his friend Platonism, conjectured something about arithmetic progressions, evenly spaced runs of numbers like 3, 7, 11, 15. They conjectured that any set of whole numbers that is dense enough, in a precise technical sense involving the sum of their reciprocals, must contain arbitrarily long such runs. He offered $5,000 for it. It remains, in its full form, unsolved to this day. But a special case of it, applied to the prime numbers, asking whether the primes themselves contain arbitrarily long, evenly spaced runs, was proved in 2004 by Ben Green and again Terence in one of the landmark results of this century. Erdős had called the prime case completely hopeless at present. It was not hopeless. It was just waiting. The Green-Tau theorem is now one of the most celebrated results in modern number theory, and it is a fragment of a question two Hungarians asked each other before the Second World War. The men are gone. Terence died in 1976. Erdős in 1996. The question is not gone. The question was never theirs. It is still out there, mostly unanswered, with $5,000 on it, waiting for the next receiver. And there is one of his results so beautiful and so useful that it has quietly worked its way into the machinery of the modern world. And it shows you that this was never just abstract play. With two collaborators, Xiao Ko and Richard Rado, all three of them refugees who had fled to England to escape the Nazis. Erdos proved a theorem in 1938 about how large a family of overlapping sets can be. The Erdos-Colorado theorem, they call it. And here is a detail that tells you everything about how the establishment treated work that did not fit its fashions. They proved it in 1938 and could not get it published until 1961. 23 years, a foundational result of an entire field, sitting in a drawer because the field it founded did not exist yet, and nobody important thought it mattered. When it finally came out, it became a cornerstone of extremal set theory, and its descendants now live inside coding theory and the error correction that lets your phone talk to a cell tower without the message dissolving into noise. First, it was unpublishable. Then, it was foundational. The one thing it was never allowed to be, for 23 years, was important, until suddenly it always had been. That pattern, the correct and beautiful thing ignored, not because it is wrong, but because it is inconvenient or unfashionable, or comes from the wrong kind of person, is not a glitch in how science works. It is a feature of it, and Erdős' life is one long demonstration of the feature. I have been telling you about the abdication of authority in mathematics, the way the establishment failed to know what to do with him. But there is a second establishment that failed even more completely to understand Paul Erdős, and its failure is so absurd, so perfectly stupid, that it would be funny if it had not stolen years of his life. I am talking about the government of the United States and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which spent decades convinced that the wandering, stateless, drug-taking, theorem-proving man with no possessions might be a spy. You have to understand his position in the world. After the war, Erdős was effectively stateless. He moved constantly across borders, including at various points between the United States and the Soviet bloc, because mathematics did not stop at the Iron Curtain, and neither did he. To the paranoid mind of the early Cold War, this was the profile of a courier, an agent, a man whose endless travel and international contacts must be cover for something. Hungary, on its side, suspected he might be an American spy. America suspected he might be a communist one. The truth, that he was neither, that he was simply a man following mathematics wherever it lived with no regard whatsoever for the political map, was apparently too simple for any intelligence service to accept. In 1954, at the height of the McCarthy era, Erdős wanted to attend a conference in Amsterdam, and to leave and re-enter the United States he needed permission. An immigration official interviewed him, and during that interview, the official asked him what he thought of Karl Marx. Now, a careful man, a frightened man, a man who understood the stakes, would have distanced himself, would have denounced, would have said the safe thing. Erdős answered honestly, the way he answered everything, with a kind of detached mathematical fairness. He said, "I am not competent to judge, but no doubt he was a great man." That was it. That was the whole crime. A factually careful, politically neutral assessment of a major historical figure, offered by a man who genuinely did not think in the categories of loyalty and betrayal that the era demanded, and for that, the United States denied him a re-entry visa and effectively locked him out of the country for most of a decade. He left for the conference and could not come back. The most prolific mathematician in the world, a Jewish refugee who had fled Hitler and built much of his life in America, was barred from returning because he would not pretend to have an opinion he did not have. Meanwhile, the FBI kept a file on him for years. They tracked his movements. They tried to make sense of the pattern. And here is the part that I find genuinely moving. In the middle of all the institutional stupidity, the Bureau, after all that surveillance, kept reaching the same conclusion, which was that there was nothing there. There was, in their own bureaucratic phrasing in the released files, nothing to indicate disloyalty. They noted that his habit of arguing all sides of a question, of playing devil's advocate, of criticizing both the American and the Soviet systems with equal detachment, reflected not subversion, but an appreciation for freedom, mental and political. They had built a machine to detect enemies, and they pointed it at Paul Erdős for years, and the machine kept printing out in effect, "This man is exactly what he appears to be. He just really, really likes mathematics." It took the Federal Bureau of Investigation a decade of surveillance to discover what any of his friends could have told them in 5 minutes over coffee. There was no hidden Paul Erdős. There was no second layer, no secret agenda, no man behind the man. He was the most transparent human being alive, because there was almost nothing there except the function. The spies went looking for the self he was hiding and could not find it, for the same reason his biographers could not find it. It had been given away, dissolved, distributed, decades ago. In 1963, he finally got his visa back. Hungary, in a strange gesture, had already granted him in 1956 the nearly unique privilege of entering and leaving the country whenever he wished, a freedom almost no one behind the Iron Curtain had. So he became, in the end, a man with a kind of citizenship of mathematics itself, moving through a world of suspicious nation-states that could never quite believe a person could be loyal only to the truth. He had no country, he had the book, and the governments of the most powerful nations on earth wasted years failing to understand that this was not a cover story. It was the entire man. I have been describing him from the outside, the suitcase, the borrowed rooms, the function, and I want to slow down for a moment and show you what it was actually like to be in a room with him, because the texture of it complicates the cold reading I have been building, and the complication matters. When Erdős arrived at your house and said, "My brain is open," what followed was not the behavior of a machine. It was something closer to a fever. He would settle onto a couch or a chair, often lying down, and he would say, "Let me think," and then he would name a problem, and the two of you would be inside it, sometimes for 16 or 18 hours, broken only by the coffee he drank constantly, and the pills he took quietly, and the meals his host had to remember to put in front of him because he would not remember on his own. He thought out loud, at speed, in a stream of half-sentences and sudden silences, and he expected you to keep up, and when you said something useful, his whole face would change. He worked the way a fire works, consuming whatever was nearest, throwing off more heat than any single person could absorb, which is part of why he needed so many hosts. One person could not survive him for long. You collaborated with Erdős in shifts, the way you would tend something that does not sleep. And here is the detail that breaks the clean machine reading and makes the whole thing harder, not easier. He loved children. The man who called children epsilons, little vanishing quantities, was tender with them in a way he could rarely manage with adults. He got down on the floor with them. He did magic tricks. Badly, he posed them tiny puzzles, sized exactly to their age, and lit up when they solved one. Parents in the mathematical world have written about how their kids adored this strange old man who arrived with a suitcase and treated them as serious people with serious minds. He never had children of his own, never had the partner that might have led to them, and yet some part of him, the part that had been a sealed-off prodigy with no playmates, knew exactly how to reach a child, because in some way that never healed he had stayed one. So when I tell you he was an instrument with the self burned away, hold this against it. The instrument got on the floor to do magic tricks for someone else's 4-year-old. There was someone home. That is the thing that turns this from a clean parable into something that actually hurts. It would be easier if there had been nobody in there. There was somebody in there. He just spent 83 years arranging his life so that the somebody almost never got to come out, and chose, again and again, the suitcase over the door it might have walked through. His hosts paid for all of it, and the stories they tell are equal parts love and exhaustion. He could not work a kitchen. There is a story, repeated by more than one of them, of Erdős attacking a carton of tomato juice with a knife because he did not understand how it was meant to open, puncturing it from the side and leaving it to bleed slowly across a counter while he went back to the mathematics, entirely unaware that anything had gone wrong, because the physical world was simply not where his attention lived. He would wander a strange house at 3 in the morning, having decided a problem could not wait, and bang pots, or knock on a bedroom door and announce that he had an idea. His friends managed his money, his travel, his clothing, his medical appointments. Ronald Graham, the man who made the $500 bet, eventually built a special room in his own house just for Erdős, and managed his finances, and signed his checks, and filed his correspondence, an arrangement Graham referred to, with the dry affection of a man who had given years to it, as taking care of business for someone who could not. The most productive mathematician in history functioned only because a small, devoted network of people quietly did everything a body needs done so that he never had to. He was carried, for 50 years, by hundreds of hands. He knew it, and he was grateful in his way, and he never for one moment considered learning to do any of it himself, because every hour spent learning to do it was an hour stolen from the only thing that counted. And what he gave back, the thing that made all those hosts decide he was worth it, was not just the theorems he helped them prove, it was the problems he left behind. Because Paul Erdős was, above everything else, the greatest poser of problems in the history of mathematics, and that is a real and rare and underrated kind of genius. The genius of knowing exactly which question, asked right now, will open a door that stays open for 50 years. His friend Ernst Strauss called him the prince of problem solvers and the absolute monarch of problem posers, and called him the Euler of our time, and both halves of that mattered. He did not just answer questions. He manufactured the questions that would shape entire careers, and he handed them out like a man scattering seeds across a continent, knowing he would not live to see most of them grow. An Erdős problem became a genre unto itself, a specific kind of question, easy to state, savage to solve, sitting at the exact edge of what was possible, with a dollar value attached that told you how far past the edge the answer lived. Mathematicians built their reputations by solving one. Whole subfields grew up around clusters of them. He understood that in an infinite subject, the scarce resource is not answers but the right questions, and he produced the right questions at a rate no one has matched before or since. And then he gave them away, every one of them, to whoever was in the room, because he did not own them any more than he owned anything else. They were not his. They were doors he had noticed in the wall of the book, and he pointed at them and said, "That one, try that one, there is something behind that one," and then he got on a plane. So far I have been showing you the instrument. I want to spend some time now with the man, the one underneath, the one who stared at the blank page during those 30 days and felt like everyone else, because he was in there the whole time, and he was afraid, and the fear is the thing the cute version of the story scrubs away most thoroughly of all. Paul Erdős was terrified of death, and he had been since he was 4 years old, and he could tell you the exact moment it started. He described it more than once. He was a small child, in a shop with his mother, and he understood, the way children eventually do, suddenly and completely, that he was going to die, that this would end, and he started to cry, there in the shop. He said that children do not believe they will ever die, and that he had been like that too, until that moment at 4, and that from then on he had always wanted to be younger. He called death his second great discovery, the first presumably being negative numbers, and there is something almost unbearable in the symmetry of that. At 3, he discovered there were numbers below 0. At 4, he discovered there was a 0 coming for him. The two discoveries that shaped his entire life were both about the existence of an abyss on the other side of the things we think are the boundary. And he never stopped fighting it, in the only ways available to a man like him, which is to say, with jokes and with work. The jokes were about age, and they ran backward, against time, the way he wanted to. He developed a running gag about his own age that depended on the age of the universe. When he was young, he said, the Earth was thought to be 2 billion years old. Now the scientists say it is 4.5 billion, which, he reasoned, made him 2.5 billion years old, because he remembered when it was only 2. He counted forward in cosmic time, so he could pretend to count backward in personal time. It is a joke, and it is also a man doing arithmetic on his own mortality in the only direction he could bear, away from the end. He gave himself a series of titles, and the titles are the saddest joke of all, because they march in exactly the direction he was terrified of. Starting in his 50s, he began signing himself PGOM, which stood for Poor Great Old Man. As he aged, he added letters. At 60, he added LD for Living Dead. At 65, AD for Archaeological Discovery. At 70, he added another LD, this one for Legally Dead. At 75, CD for Counts Dead. The string of letters after his name grew longer every 5 years, and every letter was another step toward the thing in the shop, the thing he had wanted to outrun since he was 4. He turned his own decline into a bibliography. He filed himself, year by year, under increasingly final categories, a man cataloguing his own approach to zero with the same precision he brought to everything else. The instrument was keeping a maintenance log of its own obsolescence and writing it as comedy, because the alternative was unspeakable. The work was the other weapon, and it was the real one. There will be plenty of time to rest in the grave. That was his answer to anyone who told him to slow down, to take a day off, to sleep, to eat properly, to take care of the body. The body was going to rest soon enough and forever. While it still worked, it would work 19 hours a day, because every hour not spent receiving was an hour the blank page won. He ended his work sessions with a phrase that his collaborators learned to expect, a small dark coda to a day of mathematics. We will continue tomorrow, he would say, if I live. If I live. Every single day, the awareness that the receiver might not switch back on in the morning, said lightly, said as a closing formula, the way another person says, see you tomorrow. He could not say, see you tomorrow. He could only say, if I live. And he wrote his own epitaph, in Hungarian, years before he needed it, and it is the most Erdos thing in the entire story, the whole man compressed into one line of grim mathematical humor. The epitaph reads, Vire nem butulok top. In English it means, finally, I am becoming stupider no more. Finally, I am not getting any dumber. Because to Erdos, aging was not the approach of death so much as the slow decay of the receiver, the gradual loss of the ability to catch the signal cleanly, the day-by-day stupiding of the instrument. He had a joke about this too, that there are 3 signs of senility, the first being that you forget your theorems, and the second and third being increasingly undignified things about forgetting to manage your own trousers, which I will leave you to imagine. The fear underneath the joke is the fear that the receiver degrades before it dies, that you spend your last years as a man who can no longer reach the book, who looks at the page and finds it blank, not because the drugs wore off, but because the antenna itself is corroding. And his epitaph says, finally, that stops. Finally, I am becoming stupider no more. Death, in the end, framed not as the loss of life, but as the one mercy that ends the decay. The only good thing about the abyss is that you stop getting worse at the one thing you exist to do. I want to be honest about the loneliness here, because it is the thing his friends saw and the public never did. By every account of the people closest to him, Paul Erdős was a deeply solitary man, wearing the costume of a deeply social one. He had 511 collaborators and no partner. He had 250,000 people in his network, and no one waiting for him in any of the cities he flew between. He knew, it was said, the phone numbers of mathematicians across 4 continents, and yet, at the conferences themselves, he often could not match a name to a face, could not recognize the very people he had worked with, because the connection ran through the mathematics and not through the ordinary human channels the rest of us use. He could tell you someone's theorem and not their face. The web was real, and it was vast, and it was, in the way that would have mattered to you or me, empty. He spent his nights in other people's spare rooms. He woke in houses that were not his, were never going to be his, in beds maintained by hosts who loved him and were also, many of them, exhausted by him. And then he packed the suitcase and did it again. There is a way of reading this whole life as a flight. Not just the literal flights, the endless airports, but a flight from the thing in the shop, from the blank page, from the silence that fell whenever the mathematics stopped. The work was not only his function, it was his distraction from the function ending. As long as the ideas were flooding in, he did not have to be the 4-year-old crying about death, did not have to be the grieving son after 1971, did not have to be a man alone in a rented room with nothing between him and the abyss, but a body that was, letter by letter, PG.OM to LD to AD, filing itself toward the end. He kept the page full, so he would not have to look at what the page was covering. And the amphetamines, in this reading, were not about the mathematics at all, not really. They were about keeping the flood coming, so the silence never arrived. The drug did not write the theorems. The drug held back the dark. And when Ron Graham took the drug away for 30 days, and the page went blank, what Erdos saw on that blank page was not the absence of mathematics. It was the thing the mathematics had been hiding his whole life. Himself, alone, mortal, and afraid. Just like an ordinary person. No wonder he called it a setback. No wonder he started again the moment the bet was paid. He was not protecting his productivity. He was protecting himself from 30 days a year of being nothing but a frightened man in an empty room. And here is the part I promised would arrive with a sense of inevitability. The thing you should be feeling coming now, the way you feel a drop in cabin pressure, before you understand what it is. A man who has made himself into an instrument, who has given away every connection, every possession, every fixed point, who has distributed his entire self across a network so that nothing is kept and no one is waiting, who has spent 50 years in other people's rooms precisely so that he never has to be alone with the silence, has also, without ever choosing it in so many words, guaranteed the manner of his own ending. Because an instrument that belongs to no one, that is kept in no single place, that is maintained by hundreds of hands and held by none of them, will, when it finally fails, fail somewhere among strangers, in a borrowed room, with no one whose particular job it was to be there. The most connected human being in the history of science had arranged his life, brick by brick, decision by decision, suitcase by suitcase, so that when the receiver finally went silent, it would go silent alone. He had been building toward that hospital room in Warsaw since he was a child being kept apart from other children, and he could not have stopped building toward it without becoming someone else entirely. Someone who could butter his own bread and own a home and be loved by one person rather than known by 250,000. He could not have had the work without the solitude. They were the same thing. They were always the same thing. And the solitude was going to collect, in the end, exactly what it was owed. It came in Warsaw in September of 1996. He was 83 years old, and he was, of course, at a conference. A mathematics meeting at the Banach Center, a workshop on graph theory and combinatorics, exactly the kind of gathering he had spent his life flying between. And he was, even at 83, even with the body filing itself toward the end, still working at a level that should not have been possible. 2 days before he died, by the account of Selberg, he gave a splendid talk. The day after that talk, he finished his last paper, a single-authored one, the work entirely his own, one final transcription from the book, completed by a man whose receiver was, against all odds, still pulling in the signal at the very end. And in his wallet there was a ticket. He was not done. He was already booked to leave Warsaw and travel on to the next meeting, a number theory conference in Lithuania. There was always a next conference. There was always another roof, and he intended, fully intended, to be under it, finding another proof. He had a heart attack. And then, a short time later, a second one. And on the 20th of September, 1996, in that hospital in Warsaw, Paul Erdős left. In the only sense he ever used the word for physical death. He had died, in his vocabulary, only when he stopped doing mathematics, and by that measure he never died at all, because he was doing mathematics 2 days before the end and finished a paper the day before it. He simply left. The instrument completed its last reception, and then it stopped. The popular telling of this, and you will see it everywhere, is that he died with his boots on, mid-equation, pen in hand, struck down in the very act of solving a problem. It is a beautiful image, and it is the way he said he wanted to go. His stated ideal death, for years, had been to give a lecture, finish writing the final answer to some difficult question from the audience on the blackboard, and then fall over dead, the chalk still in his hand, the proof complete. He nearly got it. But I told you at the start that I would give you the real version, even when the legend is prettier. And the real version is quieter and, I think, sadder. He did not die mid-equation. He had finished his last paper the day before. The line about dying with his boots on, in hand-to-hand combat with one more problem, the way he wanted to go, comes from Ronald Graham, his friend, speaking to a reporter after the fact. And it is a beautiful piece of eulogy, a friend giving the man the death he had wanted, even if the details were softer. And the hardest correction of all comes from Babai, who knew him and wrote the careful obituary. None of his close friends were in town, and we do not know his last words. We do not know them. The most quoted man in modern mathematics, a man whose sentences are collected and treasured, said something or nothing at the very end, alone among people who were not his people, and it is simply gone. Unrecorded, there was no one there whose job it was to listen. The mathematician Melvin Nathanson gave a eulogy for him in Budapest a few weeks later, and he gave it a name that has stuck because it says the unsayable thing directly. He called it the Erdős paradox. He said that Erdős died alone in a hospital room in Warsaw, and that this was sad and ironic because he probably had more friends in more places than any mathematician in the world. That is the paradox, stated as plainly as it can be stated. The most connected human being in the history of his field died as an unattended node, the hub of the largest collaboration network ever built, the man you can reach from almost any mathematician on earth in 5 handshakes, the center of the wheel, expired in a room where no one knew to come, in a country he was only passing through, with a ticket to somewhere else in his pocket. The network did not save him. The network could not save him. A network is not a person who sits by your bed. It is a pattern of connections, and a pattern cannot hold your hand. They brought him home, in the end, to the one place that had any claim on him. He was buried in Budapest, in the Jewish cemetery on Kozma Street, beside his mother Anna and his father Lajos. The replacement child, born into the graves of 2 sisters, laid down at last next to the 2 parents who had made him and lost him to the world and to the work. The family that history had scattered across continents and decades. The father dead of a failing heart in 1942 with his son an ocean away. The mother who survived the unsurvivable and then traveled the world on her son's arm into her 90s. The boy who could compute the seconds of a stranger's life and not tie his own shoes. All of them finally in the same small patch of Hungarian ground. He had spent 83 years being from nowhere and belonging to no one. They put him next to the only two people he had ever fully belonged to, and they were already there, waiting, the way no one had been waiting in Warsaw. That is where the biography ends. A grave in Budapest, 3 names, one family reassembled in death after a century of being torn apart in life. But the story does not end there, because the whole point of this man, the thing he believed and arranged his entire existence around, was that the grave is not where the important thing lives. The important thing was never in the body. So I want to follow the implication all the way down now, past the grave, into the place this has been heading since the first time I told you he could not boil an egg. And I want to warn you that there is no comfort waiting at the bottom of it. I am not going to make this okay. I do not think it is okay. I think it is the truest and least bearable thing his life has to show us. And I think it is about you. Start with the question I asked you to hold at the very beginning, the one his biographers never resolved. Was there ever anyone home? Was Paul Erdős a person who did mathematics? Or was he a mathematical process that briefly wore a person, the way a current wears a wire? I told you we would come back to it, and now that you have seen the whole arc, the helpless child, the dissolved self, the given away money, the chemical tuning, the distributed identity, the lonely node, I think you can feel why no one could answer it. They could not answer it, because both answers are true at once, and that is the part that does not let you sleep. Here is what every thread in this story agrees on, no matter which interpretation you reach for. You can believe that Platonism was literal, that the book is real, that the truths sit in some eternal realm, and Erdős was an antenna tuned to receive them. Or you can believe, with Günther Sickler, that the book was just a story he liked to tell, a comedian's bit, and that the mathematics was an ordinary human brain doing extraordinary human work. You can believe the amphetamines were incidental, that the obsession at age 3 is the real Erdős and the drugs just kept the lights on longer. Or you can believe the darker thing, that the great mathematician was a chemical state and the man underneath was the frightened figure staring at the blank page. You can pick any of these, and every single one of them, followed honestly to its end, arrives at the same place. The truths he found did not belong to him. They were true before he was born, and they are true now that he is 3 names on a stone in Budapest. The discrepancy problem he posed as a teenager was solved 19 years after his death by a man who had met him once as a 10-year-old. The conjecture he called hopeless is being chipped away at by people who never knew his face. The $500 and the $5,000 are still on the table, waiting. The signal he spent his life receiving did not stop when the receiver did. Other receivers tuned in. The broadcast continues, indifferent, exactly as he always said it would. The one thing all the interpretations agree on is the one thing he built his entire life around, and the one thing that should disturb you most. He was not necessary. None of us are. The truth does not need the person who finds it. And that is where this stops being a story about a strange dead Hungarian and becomes a story about you, sitting wherever you are, listening to this at whatever hour it has gotten to. Because the easy way to hold Erdős at arm's length is to call him an aberration, a freak, a man so extreme in his devotion and so broken in his development that he has nothing to do with normal human life. That is the comfortable reading, and it is wrong. And the reason it is wrong is the reason this has been worth 2 hours of your night. Erdos is not the exception to what a mind is. He is the magnified, stripped down, brutally honest version of it. He is what you look like, with everything else burned away. Think about where your own thoughts come from, not the boring ones, the ones you can trace, but the real ones, the ideas that arrive. You have had the experience of a thought simply appearing, fully formed, from somewhere you cannot point to. The solution in the shower, the connection in the half-second before sleep, the line you did not know you were going to write until it was already written. You did not construct those step by laborious step and watch yourself build them. They arrived. They came through. And you call them yours. You put your name on them, the way Erdos put his name on the pages of the book. But you know, if you are honest in the way he was honest, that you did not exactly author them. You were the place they happened. You were tuned by genetics and history and whatever you had to drink that morning to a particular state, and in that state the thoughts came through, and in another state, the blank page state, the ordinary state, they do not. You are running the same process Erdos ran. You are a receiver. You are just a dimmer one, pointed at lower frequencies, distracted by the bread and the laundry and the people who are, thank God, waiting for you somewhere. He is not a different kind of thing from you. He is your kind of thing with the dimmer switch turned all the way up and everything else turned all the way off. And what he proves, by being so extreme, is what is true of all of us and easy to miss. The self you think is generating your life may be closer to the maintenance crew around a function. The lights, the heat, the laundry, the fear, the love, all the human apparatus that keeps the receiver running, and the receiver itself doing the one thing it does, pulling in a reality that was here before you and will be here after, and does not need you and will not notice when you stop. He showed us that you can take a human being and remove the home, the partner, the children, the possessions, the country, the body's competence, the very capacity to be alone with yourself. Remove all of it, everything we use to define a person, and the receiving continues. It does not even slow down. It speeds up, which means none of those things were ever the thing doing the receiving. They were the housing. They were the building around the antenna, and he ran the experiment on himself for 83 years of finding out what is left when you tear the building down to the frame, and the answer he came back with, the answer that is sitting in 1,525 papers and 250,000 connected minds and a grave in Budapest, is that what is left is almost nothing and almost everything, a function, a flood of structure pouring through a frightened animal who could not tie his own shoes. And the animal knew, at 4 years old, crying in a shop, exactly what was coming for the frame, and spent the rest of its life keeping the page full so it would not have to look. I keep coming back to the 30 days. The 30 days he spent off the drugs, winning Ron Graham's $500, staring at the blank page, being, in his own words, just like an ordinary person. We treat that as the tragic interlude, the proof that he needed the chemistry. But turn it around one more time and look at it from the other side, the side that should genuinely keep you up tonight. For 30 days, the instrument was switched off and the man was switched on, and the man hated it. The man experienced ordinary human consciousness, the consciousness you are using right now to follow these words, the consciousness of a person looking at a blank page with no flood of structure coming through, and he described it as a setback, as a kind of death, as mathematics being thrown a month backward. He had spent so long as the instrument that being merely a person, being merely you, felt to him like loss, like the lights going out. And maybe that is the most honest thing in this entire story, more honest than the book and the Supreme Fascist and the boots on and the brain that is open. Maybe what Erdos could not stand about being ordinary was the same thing you cannot quite stand about the late hours. The reason you are watching something like this, at a time like this, instead of sleeping. The suspicion that when the flood is not coming through, when the page is blank, there is not actually very much there. That the self is loudest when it is busy receiving and goes very quiet when you finally hold still. He just had the means to keep it from ever going quiet until Warsaw, where it went quiet for good, with no one in the room. My brain is open. That was his greeting for 50 years, his hello at 500 doorways. I do not think it was a boast. I think, in the end, it was the most accurate self-description a human has ever offered, and the loneliest. Not my heart is open, not my home, he had none, not my arms, my brain is open, the one aperture that mattered, the one that let the signal in. He arrived everywhere announcing that the receiver was switched on and ready, and he left everywhere when the local problems were exhausted, and he never once, in 50 years, arrived anywhere and said, I am tired, I am afraid, I do not want to be alone tonight. He said, my brain is open, and he meant the door to the book. And he kept that door open at the cost of every other door a person has. And he closed all of them so completely that when the last day came, there was no one on the other side of any of them. The truths he gave his life to are still out there. That is not a consolation. That is the horror, stated plainly, the thing the comfortable version can never say. The probabilistic method does not remember him. The happy ending problem does not mourn. The prime numbers go on thinning out exactly as the theorem says, and the theorem does not know it had a discoverer. Because it did not really. It had a receiver, and receivers are interchangeable, and a new one met him in Adelaide at the age of 10, and finished one of his problems the year before this footage you might be watching was even possible. The book is full, and it is open, and it does not contain a page for Paul Erdős, the man, the 4-year-old in the shop, the son who could not get home in time, the figure at the dinner table falling asleep the moment the talk turned away from numbers. It contains his proofs, scrubbed of him, perfect, eternal. His name a label on a specimen he was lucky enough to be standing near when it came through. He wanted to be immortal through mathematics. He said it plainly, that mathematics was the surest path, that the great discoverer is remembered when everyone else is forgotten. And he got exactly that, and it is so much colder than he let himself say. He is remembered the way a wire is remembered by the current that once ran through it, which is to say not at all, while the current goes on to other wires. The thing that was immortal was never going to be him. It was going to be the truth, which was already immortal, which let him touch it for 83 years and then let him go without a flicker. He spent his whole life in service of something that could not, by its nature, ever love him back or even notice he was gone. And he knew it. That is the part I cannot get past. He was the most honest man in this story, and he knew it the whole time. And he kept his brain open anyway, and he flew to the next conference anyway, with the ticket in his wallet, because the alternative was the blank page, and the blank page was the abyss in the shop, and he had been running from it since he was 4. So I will leave you where he left himself, not with the work, which survives and does not care, with the man who did not. A hospital room in Warsaw in September, with no one in it who knew him. A ticket to Lithuania in the pocket of a coat he would not put on again. A last paper finished the day before, one final page caught and written down and sent on ahead into the literature, where it sits right now, true, complete, and as indifferent to its author as the day the universe first made it. And somewhere a few weeks later, a man standing up in Budapest to say the only thing left to say, that Erdos died alone, and that the strangest part, the part that does not resolve and was never going to resolve, is that he had more friends than any mathematician on earth. His brain was open until the end. And then, it was not. And the network he built, the 250,000 minds, The 511 names, the wheel with him at the hub, registered the loss the way a graph registers a deleted node. A few edges go dark. The structure barely changes. The truth keeps coming through everyone else. You are a receiver too. You have been one this whole time, reading this, the thoughts arriving from somewhere you cannot point to, calling them yours. One day yours will go dark in some room, and the signal will not stop. It will find the next one. It always has. Paul Erdős understood that better than anyone who has ever lived, and he kept his brain open anyway, all the way to the bottom, because he had nothing else to keep open and nowhere else to go. Finally, he is becoming stupider no more.